our next lesson is multiplying integers, and we only have one essential question in this video is how do you multiply integers? So now we're going to move on to our next operation, which is multiplication. Now again, I'm going to use a pattern here to kind of make predictions about what happens when you multiply with negative numbers. We already know how to multiply with positive numbers, so we kind of want to extend what we already know into the negative. So here we're going to do these multiplication problems, and we're just going to look for patterns here and see if we can make predictions about what's going to happen. So let's start here with 5 times 3, which is 15, and then 5 times 2 is 10, 5 times 1 is 5, and 5 times 0 is 0. Now that is something we should already know, but we're going to use this pattern now to extend it. What should 5 times negative 1 be? What should be the next number in this pattern? What's happening to our products as we decrease what we're multiplying 5 by? Well, every time we decrease what we're multiplying 5 by, we're decreasing by 5. We have one less group of 5, so we're always decreasing by 5. Now this pattern has to continue. We wouldn't expect anything to change, so this should decrease by 5 again, giving us what? Well, what's 0 minus 5? We just talked about subtraction. 0 minus 5 is negative 5. So 5 times negative 1 should be negative 5. That makes sense. That's like 5 groups of negative 1 is negative 5. So then if we continue this pattern and decrease by 5 again, what would be 5 times negative 2? 5 times negative 2 should be negative 10. And then if we decrease that by 5 again, one less group of 5, 5 times negative 3 would be negative 15. Now this pattern is going to continue on and on forever, and they're just going to keep getting more and more negative. So now we can say that when we multiply positive times a negative, that's going to end up being a negative number. Okay, so now let's go to the next column over here, and we've got a negative 5 times 3. Well, we just saw, or we just observed, that a positive times a negative is going to be a negative value. So negative 5 times 3 should be negative 15, and negative 5 times 2 should be negative 10, and negative 5 times 1 should be negative 5. And negative 5 times 0, well, anything times 0 is 0. And now we change again. Now we've got a negative times a negative. And what's going to happen here? So again, we can continue looking at this pattern. What happens when we decrease what we're multiplying a negative number times? The value is not going down by 5, actually. It's actually increasing by 5. This is going up 5 every time. We have one less group of a negative number, so that's going to be like taking negatives away, and we saw that that increases value. So what's going to be the next value here? We're going to increase by 5 again. Negative 5 times negative 1 should be 0 plus 5, which is positive 5. Now that seems kind of weird, but this pattern shows us that has to be true. And then it's going to increase by 5 again, and 5 times negative 2 is going to have to be positive 10, and then it's going to increase by 5 again, and negative 5 times negative 3 is positive 15. So now we've basically covered all the possible scenarios we could have when we're multiplying two numbers together, and you can kind of see them separated here. I'm going to draw a line here and here, and then cut that here. Now up here, this is positive times a positive. And a positive times a positive always ends up to be what kind of number? Well, these are all positive numbers, so a positive times a positive always ends up being positive. And then down here in the lower left, we have a positive number times a negative number, and all of those ended up being negative. And in the upper right here, we have a negative times a positive, and all of those numbers turned out to be negative. And then down here, we have a negative number times a negative number, and all of those turned out to be positive. And then here in the middle, we just had a positive times 0 and a negative times 0. Both of those turned out to be 0 because we know that anything times 0 is always 0. But really, we want to just focus on these 4 possible outcomes here when we're multiplying something by a number that's non-zero. So here is a take-home point that we want to have in our notes for sure. When we multiply two integers with the same sign, a positive times a positive or a negative times a negative, that's going to turn out to be positive. Positive times a positive, negative times a negative, those both turn out to be positive. So a positive times a positive is positive, and a negative times a negative is positive. So when the signs are the same, your product is going to always be positive. And then likewise, we have multiplying numbers with two different signs. So a positive times a negative is going to be negative, and a negative times a positive is going to be negative. And those are the only real rules that we need to learn when we're talking about multiplication. Is if the signs are the same, it's positive. If the signs are different, it's negative. Really pretty simple. One of the easier operations to do with integers. And here I just want to talk about ways of showing multiplication. There's a lot of ways to show multiplication in math, so I just want to cover those so we don't get confused. One of them would be using the traditional multiplication sign. Another would be using the dot, 8 times 12. Sometimes we can just use parentheses to show multiplication, or sometimes we use an asterisk to show multiplication. And then sometimes we use nothing at all, and we usually use that with a variable. So 8b means 8 times b. Now I like to point this out because none of the other operations really have a lot of ways to be shown. Multiplication for some reason has a lot of ways to be shown, so I just wanted to point those out. So let's use what we've observed here to find the products, and we're just going to multiply and use our rules to find out whether our product is going to be positive or negative. Now negative 3 times 12, well 3 times 12 is 36. Now the signs are different, so this is going to be a negative 36. A negative times a positive is going to be negative. Next one, negative 5 times negative 11. Well, 5 times 11 is 55. And the signs here are the same, so that's going to be a positive 55. Next, we have negative 6 times negative 12. 6 times 12 is 72, and since these are the same sign, a negative times a negative, that's going to end up being a positive 72. And then lastly, negative 6 times 7. Well, 6 times 7 is 42, and since the signs are different, this is going to be a negative 42. And that's pretty much multiplying two integers. Very easy to do. If the signs are the same, it's going to be positive. If the signs are different, it's going to be negative. Well, what happens when we multiply multiple numbers together? What happens if we're multiplying 3 numbers together, 4 numbers together, or more than 4 numbers together? Well, let's try to make some predictions here on what these types of products are going to be. So if you'd like to pause the video and make a prediction on these 3 scenarios, that'd be great, because I'm going to explain how they turn out right now. A negative times a negative times a negative. Now, how do you think that's going to turn out? Now, a lot of people, once they learn the rules to multiplication, will say, well, all the signs are the same, so this is actually going to turn out positive. Well, you'd actually be incorrect, because if we take these 2 at a time, and if we multiply this negative times a negative, that's going to be positive. And then I have to multiply it by this negative number right here. And a positive times a negative is negative. So this is actually going to turn out negative. A negative times a negative will be negative. Next one, negative times a positive times a negative. How is this one going to turn out? Well, you would think, well, signs are different, so it's going to turn out negative. Well, if I multiply 2 at a time, this negative times this positive is going to be negative, and then I have to multiply by this negative, and a negative times a negative, yep, that turned out positive. So we have to kind of group them 2 at a time and apply those rules when we're multiplying more than 2 integers at a time. So how do you think this last one is going to turn out? Negative times a negative times a negative times a negative. Well, if we take them 2 at a time, I'm actually going to group these together. This negative times this negative is positive, and this negative times this negative would be positive, and the positive times the positive would end up positive. So when we're multiplying more than 2 integers together, we have to take them 2 at a time. So let's practice that here with these 2 examples. Negative 7 times 9 times negative 6. So this is a negative times a positive times a negative. So this is actually going to turn out to be positive. Okay, this product is actually going to turn out to be positive, and I'll show you why. If I take these first 2 and multiply them together, negative 7 times positive 9 is a negative 63, because the signs are different. And then I'm going to multiply that by the negative 6. So that gives me a negative 63 times negative 6. A negative times a negative is positive, positive 378. And then the last one, negative 3 times negative 4 is a positive 12. And then positive 12 times negative 5 is going to be negative 60. So when we're multiplying multiple numbers together, we have to take them 2 at a time, applying our rules. If the signs are the same, the product is positive. If the signs are different, the product is negative.